I'm Morgan.
I'm DeLacy Louise.
I'm Mary Elliott.
And I'm Layla.
And the title of our research is Should Facility Dogs Assist Adult Victims of Sexual Assault in Court?
So we're going to start off with a few statistics. So it is estimated that only 230 out of every 1,000 sexual assault cases get reported to law enforcement. That means roughly 3/4 of the sexual assaults that happen go unreported. Of the ones that are reported, 85 to 90% of them never make it to trial. While many factors play into this, these cases being dropped, research shows that fear of testifying is a very significant factor. This is supported by evidence finding that 94% of women who have experienced sexual assault have at least one symptom of PTSD following their assault. So fear of speaking about their assault during testimony can be so strong that victims choose to drop the case altogether. So why is testifying so traumatic? Well, the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution, commonly known as the Confrontation Clause, guarantees the defendant the right to face their accuser in court and cross-examine them. While this clause protects the rights of the defendant, it fails to consider the risk of re-exposing the victim to their offender. The sight of a victim's assailant can be so severe that it can serve as a traumatic trigger. In fact, research by Vander Kolk shows that exposure to traumatic triggers decreases brain activity in areas associated with speech and communication and increases activity in areas associated with fear. Therefore, it's not uncommon for victims to freeze or become re-traumatized on the stand. In light of all of this, many courts offer accommodations to ease witness anxiety while testifying. One accommodation that is increasing in popularity is the use of courthouse facility dogs.
A facility dog is a specially trained support dog who's able to provide vulnerable witnesses with a calming presence in legal settings, especially during potentially traumatizing testimony. During testimony, these dogs will lay silently within reach of the witness in order to settle their nerves and ease any anxieties. Each dog has been specially trained and certified to ensure that they are quiet and non-obstructive to the proceedings of court. Currently, there are 234 facility dogs being used in courtrooms across 40 states, with 4 currently in use in South Carolina. Each dog is certified and trained under Assistance Dogs International programs. Research has shown that there are several benefits to using these dogs as accommodations in our legal system. For instance, research has shown that children who are accompanied by a facility dog during a forensic interview showed significant decreases in stress biomarkers as compared to children who were not accompanied by a dog. Similarly, research has also found that children who are accompanied by a dog showed significant increases in disclosure rates of abuse. So clearly, there are potential benefits to using these dogs in our legal system. However, the use of these dogs to help vulnerable witnesses does not come without controversy, as many in the legal system have argued that the presence of these dogs next to vulnerable witnesses could increase the appearance of victimization, imply the credibility of the victim, potentially distract the victim, and therefore unfairly influence jurors by eliciting improper sympathy towards the victim. The concern is that as a result of this, jurors could be more punitive towards the defendant. In light of these arguments, courts must perform what's called a balancing test, in which the judge must weigh the potential benefits of accommodation against the potential juror bias in order to make the decision that will best uphold the rights of both the witness and the defendant. So far, judges have ruled in favor of the prosecution every time, allowing the facility dog into their courtroom without fully understanding the impact. Research has examined jurors' reactions to the presence of the facility dog in order to fully understand what their impact is in the courtroom. In several studies, Bird and McQuiston found that mock jurors showed no bias towards a testifying child victim when a facility dog was present, nor did the presence of the facility dog alongside this child victim prejudice jurors against the defendant.
So we often hear about child victims of sexual abuse. However, adults can be victims as well, but they face a few different challenges. For example, adult victims of sexual abuse or sexual assault face the challenge of victim blaming, which is where the blame is transferred from the defendant or the perpetrator to the victim. Common examples of victim blaming are asking what the victim was wearing or whether the victim was irresponsibly intoxicated. That can be so severe that victims may not testify later in court. We often, way more often, hear about female victims of sexual assault rather than male victims. And that's because of our cultural stereotypes and beliefs about men being aggressive, strong, and sexually dominant. And so that's actually called the male rape myth, which makes us think as a society that men cannot be sexually assaulted, that it's impossible for them to be sexually abused or sexually assaulted. when in actuality, men make up 3 to 10% of all sexual assault victims, which means that we are ignoring about 10% of the victims of severely violent crimes, which is an explanation for why there's a very small body of research for male victims in court, and even less for male victims that are accompanied by a facility dog in court.
The purpose of this study was to determine how the presence of a facility dog in the court influenced mock juror perceptions and judgments of a male and female victim of sexual assault, the defendant, and the case in general. This was a 2x2 research design in which we manipulated the presence of the dog, dog or no dog, and the victim gender, male or female.
Based on previous research, it was hypothesized that the overall presence of a dog would have no impact on the mock juror's evaluation of the victim or defendant. It was also hypothesized that the male would be more harshly judged, and this was based off of the ideas of stereotypical sexual assault cases. It was also hypothesized that the presence of a dog will only have an impact when the victim is male. This means that when the female victim is accompanied by a dog versus no dog, there will be no effect. But when the male victim is accompanied by a dog, he will be judged more harshly than when he is not accompanied by a dog.
134 jury-eligible participants were recruited from Spartanburg, South Carolina, and surrounding areas. 61% of participants were female. The average age was 42 years old, and the majority of participants were white. Participants were given a fictitious criminal case in which a male or female 21-year-old claimed to have been sexually assaulted at a party. The defendant denied the charges. There either was or was not a facility dog present to comfort the alleged victim. Materials included a summary of the facts and allegations of the case, and a partial trial transcript in which was included the judge's instructions, attorney's opening and closing statements, and a direct examination of the alleged victim. Along with this information was a photograph depicting the victim either with or without a facility dog. After reading the case, participants then filled out a dependent measures questionnaire, which included items about the victim, the defendant, and the case. For example, how believable is the defendant, how credible is the victim, or how much sympathy do you feel towards the victim? And lastly, participants answered several demographic questions.
All right, so in terms of our main effects and interactions, we found no significant main effect of dog presence. However, we did find a significant main effect for victim gender for this one dependent measure of disgust. So when we asked our participants how much disgust they felt towards the defendant, as you can see on this graph, there was much more disgust when the victim was a female versus when the victim was a male. So we also found no significant interactions. But what this research and these results tell us is that the presence of the dog, since we found no significant main effect, does not have any effect on the mock jurors' feelings about guilt or innocence of the defendant. But because we found those results, we decided to split our participants by gender. And so when we did that, we found no significant results for the females. But for our male participants, we actually found that they thought that the victim, when the victim was a female, they expressed more anger towards the defendant. And then when the victim was accompanied by a dog, only our male participants believed and liked the victim more. They thought the victim was more credible and more convincing. They felt more sympathy for the victim. They thought the case against the defendant was stronger, and they thought there was a greater likelihood that the victim was lying. And so keep in mind that all of these are only for our male participants and not at all for our female participants. However, the number of participants that we had for these results were so small because of the difficulty of conducting this experiment on a large scale. So we would need to collect more data to be able to still find significant results possibly for this. However, when you look at these pie charts, when you compare the dog present condition to the no dog present condition, you can see that roughly the same number of participants thought the defendant was guilty. So this tells us that the presence of a dog does not significantly impact the results of whether a defendant is found guilty or innocent. And so that's the main concern of our research along with the legal field. So based on this, we have no evidence that a dog has any biasing effect in a trial against a defendant. And lastly, just another interesting finding that we had was one of our last questions asked our potential mock jurors how they would feel if they were on a jury and a facility dog accompanied a witness for comfort. So what they could choose from were these different effects. So there was no effect. They thought maybe it would be distracting to them as a juror. They thought the dog was unnecessary, that it would elicit extra sympathy towards the victim, that it would make the defendant seem dangerous, that it would increase the credibility of the victim in their eyes, or that it could be distracting to the victim to have that dog. So we pay the most attention to that credibility factor because it's very dangerous for the defendant in his or her trial if a potential juror finds a dog to elicit greater credibility towards that victim. If a victim is seen as more credible because they have a dog with them while they're testifying, that is then going maybe to relate back to the defendant in their finding of guilt or innocence.
These results support the previous literature that we looked into, which provides no evidence that dogs are prejudicial in courtrooms. Even with the findings that the male participants favoring the victims with a dog, there was no effect on the judgments towards the defendants. It was an interesting finding that females did not react to the presence of a dog, but the male participants did. It's possible that females react differently towards sexual assault cases and that there is a ceiling effect in empathy and sympathy towards the victim. This may not be the case for males when providing enough variance for significant effects. More data would need to be collected in order to see if this were true. An important aspect of experimental design to consider is that we were not able to fully cross perpetrator gender with victim gender. Within this, our independent variable only consisted of victim gender, in which the female was victimized by a male, and the female victim was victimized by a male, and the male victim was victimized by a female. We could have kept perpetrator gender constant, but this would have resulted in one same-sex assault versus one opposite-sex assault. Alternatively, we could have kept perpetrator gender ambiguous, but this would have resulted in a host of assumptions made by the participants. An important consideration for future research would be to provide a more realistic mock trial in which the trial were videotaped and shown to mock jurors that way. An interesting avenue for research would be to look into whether dogs simply provide more comfort for victims or whether or not they increase the accuracy of a witness testimony during trial. Overall, these results provide additional support for the use of facility dogs in courtrooms for vulnerable victims in need of that assistance.
So we would like to thank our advisor, Dr. Don McQuiston, as well as Judge Mark Hayes, who is sitting back there, for letting us use his courtroom to take our pictures, and Dallas Meacham as well, and our actors and dog model Ace, and all of our community participants.